Hello, everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit on behalf of webyeshiva.org, where we're studying Rabbi Saadia Gaon's 10th century work, Emunot Videot, a book of proper beliefs and opinions. Um, the translation that we're trying to use, in addition to so many of the other Hebrew texts that are available out there for Emunot Videot, it's the Samuel Rosenblatt edition that was published by Yale University Press back in 1948. It seems to be the only English edition that has the entire Emunot Videot in it. And so that's what we're trying to work through. We are in the middle of the introduction, and as we've mentioned in the past, the structure of Emunot Videot is that it is a series of 10 essays, but preceded by a lengthy introduction. So we are in the introduction. We're in section 5 of the introduction, which we plan to finish today. And we found ourselves being presented by Rabbi Saadia Gaon with an extensive discussion of epistemology, how it is that people gain knowledge about anything, and how you can verify and be assured that the knowledge that you have is accurate, truthful knowledge. This is, of course, important to the philosopher because when studying Jewish philosophy, you want to make sure that not only do you have a received tradition of the Torah, but that it is intellectually satisfying as well, that the knowledge that you have based upon our tradition is in some way homogenized with your intellect to make sure that it is completely a part of you. And that's really the approach that Rabbi Saadia is taking. And so we're going to continue where we left off. We're in the middle of section 5 of the introduction, and I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's see. I forgot to record the meeting, so I better start recording. Here we are once again, Daniel Karapkin here for webyeshiva.org, where we're continuing section 5 of the introduction. So let me share my screen with you, and we'll we'll continue where we left off from last time. And our topic today is the 7 errors to avoid in inductive reasoning. And just to get our bearings as to where we are for today, Rabbi Saadia up until now has clarified that one of the methods of arriving at knowledge is through inductive reasoning. And that is, once someone has perceived the phenomenon, he induces from this visual or audio experience a set of rules or a science that helps to explain the perceived phenomenon. Now, I just want to review for us the example that Rabbi Saadia gave that we studied last week. He started talking about the observation of the motion of the moon. And we noticed that the moon, in its ecliptic, in its trajectory across the sky over the course of an evening, moves unevenly at different speeds and at different trajectories, different velocities. So the moon's motion is an uneven motion. That's what even ancient astronomers had observed. There are a number of things that one can use inductive reasoning. Once you observe a phenomenon, you want to be able to apply a general rule to explain that phenomenon. That's induction. And that's what Rabbi Saadia is talking about. And he says the way that we account for the uneven motion of the moon is through constructing this system of 28 different stations. According to some medieval philosophers, it's only 27 stations, but there are 27 or 28 celestial bodies that are responsible for the motion of the moon. And as the moon moves through the sky, it is influenced and affected by these 28 different celestial bodies that are in some way influencing the direction and the speed of the motion of the moon. Now, that is science for Rabbi Saadia. Now, this concept should not be foreign to us, but in modern science, we would call this more of a theory or a hypothesis, but we wouldn't call it a science. And I just want to point out that that's because since the 17th century, since the Renaissance, we were introduced to something in science called the scientific method, which proves theories in the laboratory in order to consider them established science. And unless you can prove a theory, it's not considered science. But that's all long after Rabbi Saadia Gaon has lived. It's important to realize that one of the methods of attaining knowledge is through pure empirical experimentation and the gathering of data. But because so much of the universe, especially in the astronomical celestial realm, is unmeasurable, you can't measure those things in a laboratory in the medieval and ancient world, the science of Reb Saadia's time is also using inductive reasoning to come up with a reasonable theory for how things work in the universe based on our observation, and applying logic to those observations, and then coming up with a working theory. And that too is considered science. Rabbi Saadia's example of the different celestial bodies that influence the motion of the moon is a perfect example of something he believed to be scientific fact, but that we would consider purely a theory derived through logical induction. And, the, and we would be correct in just calling it a theory, because certainly since then, we have other explanations for the motion of the moon in its uneven trajectory across the sky that has nothing to do with it being influenced by celestial bodies that are nowhere near proximal to the moon. Okay, so it's important for us to sort of transport ourselves to this medieval milieu of the 10th century, and understand where Rabbi Saadia is coming from as we follow through his philosophical presentation of how human beings gain true knowledge. Now, he says the causes of the moon's motion that we have been discussing can be demonstrated by rules of geometry. And here he's going to lay out for us how the way that you develop a theory, a scientific theory, is you take simplistic concepts and you build upon them. And as they become more and more complicated, they can help to account for observed and perceived phenomena. In order to master the science of geometry, we start with simple knowledge and advance to more complex exercises. In order to arrive at plane geometry, for example, two-dimensional geometry, we first start with the study of points, then lines, and then eventually plane shapes such as triangles, squares, circles, intersecting shapes, tangential shapes, and secants, which are lines that intersect curves in at least 2 points. This is the known geometry of its time. And anyone who studies geometry knows, you start off with a point, then a line, then two-dimensional shapes, and then you get into more complex intersections of different plane shapes. From there, we advance to three-dimensional geometry so that we understand how three-dimensional objects intersect, what types of intersections are possible, and what types of manipulations of geometric three-dimensional shapes are not possible. These studies lead us to understand how the celestial bodies impact each other, whether the structure of these bodies are spherical or round, and how some bodies are intertwined with others. With the completion of these scientific studies, we conclude that the motion of the moon is based on 5 different factors. Now, these 5 different factors are not enumerated by Reb Saadia, nor is it necessary for us to delve into them, because it is archaic, outdated science. The point that we are trying to infer from what Reb Saadia is teaching us now is this is how inductive reasoning leads us to certain scientific theories of how the universe works and what reality is. We must submit that each one of these factors, of these 5 factors that are the cause of the motion of the moon, is true, because otherwise we would not be able to account for the changes in the moon's motion based on the laws of nature. So this is really where Reb Saadia now concludes his presentation of this idea of inductive reasoning, because as you'll recall from the beginning of the introduction, Rabbi Saadia has said that there are 3 bases for any human being attaining knowledge. One is through empirical perception and observation. The second through is intuitive rationality, certain ideas that a priori come into my mind even without any empirical observation. And 3, applying logic to those first 2 categories to expand upon through inductive reasoning to come to certain conclusions about what reality is. Now that we've explained how man obtains knowledge through logical inference or induction, we will now discuss how to protect this process from error. Because clearly, since we're living at a time in Ripsage's generation where we aren't applying scientific method, there is a much greater likelihood that any scientific explanation that we come up with is going to be subject to error. And of course, historically, we know that's true. We know that so much, let's say, for example, of Aristotelian science is outdated and has been proven to be not the way the universe works. But that's okay, because trying at least to understand how a human being can acquire knowledge even before we use scientific method is I think, of help to us. Perhaps today we might say, oh, this is very primitive, this is archaic thinking, but not necessarily so. It might very well be to our benefit to study these methods of acquiring knowledge outside of the laboratory, because sometimes there might be things that the laboratory would miss that we might gain insights to if we study something that's much older that is not committed exclusively to the laboratory. And as Ripsage writes, for most of human controversies and differences in evidence stem from these errors. That's the reason why people disagree, is because different people come up with different explanations through inductive reasoning as how the universe works. And because there are different theories out there, people end up disagreeing with each other. Now, Ripsage will present 5 different potential errors that can be made when exercising logical inference. And this is true even today, because there are many things that we can't prove in the laboratory. And that's why scientific theorists disagree about things like dark matter and string theory and things like that. So what are the 5 errors that people are prone to make, which could lead them down the wrong path in the acquisition of knowledge? So he's going to present us with 5 and then conclude with an additional 2. And that's what we're going to focus on for today. The first error that a person can make is when inducting from sensory experience, such that one concludes, based on what I have seen, such and such is true. We must inquire as to whether his hypothesis is the only cogent one based on his perception. Could the sensory observation be supported by a completely different hypothesis? Now, these potential errors, for each one, Ripsage is going to give us an example. So what he's telling us now is, yes, you've come up with a cogent explanation as to the phenomenon you've observed. Is that the only explanation? Or could there be an equally cogent explanation, in which case you have to not rule that possibility out? For example, when people observe the white streaks of the Milky Way in the sky, which we know are clusters of galaxies not galaxies, of solar systems far away from us, some believe that its whiteness is due to the sun's sphere's trajectory previously occupying that position. The belief is that as the sun moves through the sky, it almost leaves like a trail, like a comet. And that's what you're seeing when you see this whiteness in the sky, which we know today is really just a cluster of stars and solar systems. But there might be a completely different explanation. The whiteness might be due to rising mists that fill the sky. Sometimes you might see a very, very far away misty cloud that you could confuse for a group of, that you could confuse for the Milky Way. Some particles of fire that occupy the sky, which certainly is not in sync with modern science. Or it could be a cluster of tiny stars, which is really what we understand the Milky Way to be. Or it could be something completely different. Accordingly, whatever theory you come up with has to be subjected to the question, is there the possibility that it's something else? Maybe it's not the trail or the tail of the sun in its trajectory through the sky. Maybe it's something else. So that's the first error that people make, is they come up with one solution, not thinking of other possible solutions, and they commit to that one solution in error because they fail to look at other possible solutions to or explanations to their observations. Now, the second error is almost the same as the first. The only difference is that it's an error that you make when trying to account for some intuitive, rational reasoning that is not based on perception, but is based on the second method of how people attain knowledge, which is what we would call a priori knowledge, of an idea that comes into your mind that is independent of your sensory perception. When inducting not from sensory experience, but rather from a rational concept, and we refer you back to where he talked about that before, where he said, especially when it comes to issues of, let's say, making moral judgments of what's good and bad, people tend to have instinctive knowledge of these things, not based on their perceptions, their sensory perceptions, but just based upon the fact that I'm a thinking individual and I've been endowed with certain intuitions of my rationality. A person may make the same error, therefore. He may say, based on what I have intuited to be true, such and such must also be true. Here, too, we must ask, could a completely different corollary of his intuited rationale instead be true and his initial conclusion false? For example, people have intuited that the most important component of a system is contained in the center of that system. This is through intuitive a priori reasoning. That if you ask a person, I have a system, let's say a universal construct, a solar system, what is the most important part of that system? You would say that which is in the center. Now hold that idea for just a second. If you're thinking about this, you're probably thinking about, wow, has science changed from the times when we thought that the Earth was in the center of the universe to now where we realize that the Earth really revolves around the sun. Hold on to that for just a minute. But based on that rational premise, some have concluded that there must be another world that revolves around our world. The basis for this conclusion is that people note that the fire which comprises the celestial spheres is above our world. Being that the celestial spheres are the most important components of creation, we must conclude that there is another world beyond the celestial spheres which encompasses those spheres. The idea that Reb Saj is presenting is this. When we look at the grand universe that is around us, we assume that the earth, where man abides, is in the center of this universe that is all around us. But then we make note of the celestial spheres. And when we studied Moreh Nevuchim, when we studied Rambam's Guide of the Perplexed, we explained that the Ptolemaic planetary system is such where the earth is bounded by these transparent spheres which contain the orbits of all of the heavenly bodies, the stars, the sun, the moon, etc. And they're constantly in motion. All we see are the planetary bodies. We don't witness the actual spheres. The spheres are transparent, but those spheres are the things that are causing everything to move in sync, each sphere containing different celestial bodies. Now, put that aside for just a minute. But there was a medieval concept that these spheres were not just creations that are inanimate, but that they were actually intelligences. They actually, each of these spheres was in some way triggered by the ultimate deity, and that this ultimate deity emanated some of his intellect or intelligence upon these spheres, and each sphere, therefore, is a cognizant being that is constantly in motion. Now, with this idea, I know it's very foreign for anyone who's hearing this for the first time, but with this idea in mind, the idea was that these intelligences of the spheres are far superior than mortal man. And if so, wouldn't we expect that these celestial spheres should be at the center of the universe and not at the periphery of man's universe? Why is man, who is an inferior being, surrounded by superior intelligent beings of these celestial spheres that are perfect in every way, that are angelic in the way that they've been described by ancient philosophers, especially religious philosophers? Why would we say that they revolve around man? Shouldn't there be something, shouldn't they be at the center of a much larger system? So indeed, this is what Reb Saj is referring to. He's saying that many people believed that there must be another world beyond the celestial spheres in order to make the celestial spheres at the center of that universe, because the most important existent being is at the center of every system. So we would refute that conclusion with the assertion that no, to the contrary, it is man and not the celestial spheres who is the most important component of creation, and that is why man's realm is situated in the center of the universe. So this is based on not empirical data, but rather based upon one's rational conclusions that anything that is the most important part of a system must be at the center. That's based on intuition. Okay. And now, the reason why this is so interesting is because Reb Sadia has made two basic assumptions that must not be overlooked. Number one, that whatever is in the center of creation is the most important. And he says that's not based on empirical observation and perception, but it is rather based upon rational intuition. That if you are if the universe exists based upon the tutelage of some divine being, some supreme being, logic only dictates, rationality dictates that anything that is the most precious part of that system should be protected, just like the yolk of an egg, which is surrounded by the white of the egg. Anything that is the most important should be in the center. Now, what does this remind you of? This is consistent with the medieval church's belief that the earth must be at the center of the universe. And it also explains why there was so much resistance to the proofs of Copernicus and Galileo much later, and many centuries after Reb Sadia lives, who argued that the sun was in the center. Now that we understand that the sun is at the center of our solar system, and that furthermore, even in the 20th century, we discover that our solar system is really part of a much larger galaxy, and that our solar system is not at all in the center of that galaxy, and that furthermore, the Milky Way galaxy is one of billions of other galaxies, and by no means is our galaxy necessarily situated in the center of that universe of galaxies. Well, then, this whole intuitive idea that that which is the most important is in the center really falls by the wayside. So that's really, again, Rebbe Sadia inadvertently revealing to the more modern man the error of this process. However, even within his erroneous conclusions, there has to be a system. So he says, don't make the mistake that some people made once they've established that the most important thing must be in the center to conclude that there must be a world beyond the celestial spheres, because in reality, man is at the center, and man, not the celestial spheres, is the most important component of creation. And that is the second assumption that Reb Sadia makes, that man is the most important component of creation, more so even than the celestial bodies, which, according to the Rambam, are where the angels are, or are synonymous with angelic beings that are described in Tanakh. Now, this is refuted by the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim in section 3, chapters 13 and 14. And just to provide one little snippet from the guide, he said, the Rambam writes, I consider, therefore, the following opinion as most correct according to the teaching of the Bible, and best in accordance with the results of philosophy. In other words, what I believe to be true based on my study of Tanakh and based on my study of Aristotelian philosophy is that the universe does not exist for man's sake, but that each being exists for its own sake and not because of some other thing. Thus, we believe in the creation, and yet need not inquire what purpose is served by each species of the existing things, because we assume that God created all parts of the universe by his will, some for their own sake and some for the sake of other beings. In other words, he started off with the question, why do the tigers in the Amazon, for example, exist? If the whole purpose of existence is for the sake of man, how do creatures that man never interacts with, how do you account for their purpose? And he says, no, that's a false assumption. Not everything exists for the sake of man, that include their own purpose in themselves. In the same manner as it was the will of God that man should exist, so it was his will that the heavens with their stars should exist, that there should be angels, and each of these beings is itself the purpose of its own existence. When anything can only exist provided some other thing has previously existed, God has caused the latter to precede it, as, for example, sensation precedes comprehension. And just to read a few lines beyond that, You must not be mistaken and think that the spheres and the angels were created for our sake. Our position has already been pointed out to us that it says in Isaiah, behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket. Now compare your own essence with that of the spheres, the stars, and the intelligences of those spheres, and you will comprehend the truth and understand that man is superior to everything formed of earthly matter, but not to other beings. Man is not the most superior being of all of creation, according to the Rambam. He is found exceedingly inferior when his existence is compared with that of the spheres, and a fortiori when compared with that of the intelligences, the intelligences of those spheres. Now, what you see from here is that the Rambam completely, vigorously disagrees with Reb Sajja's assumption that that which is in the center must be the most important. You can have celestial spheres and the intelligences of those spheres and the angels of those spheres all revolving around man, and man is still the inferior being in that system. So put that all of aside, but at least from Reb Sajja's perspective, man must be the crowning element of creation by virtue of the fact that he is in the center of the universe. Okay, let us go on. Let's look at the third error that people make. Another error of induction might involve believing in a general principle based on what one has observed with the senses. So, however, one must ensure that his conclusion does not contradict another inducted rule that is also based on sensory perception. So I may come up with two conclusions based on two different observations. I have to make sure that the two conclusions do not contradict each other. Because if I do find contradiction, I will be forced to choose which is the more compelling sensory experience and the corollaries that emanate, the logical corollaries that emanate from that sensory experience. For example, some believe that all living creatures are created from the element of water because all living creatures have moisture as their primary ingredient. So therefore, we must conclude, say, goes the argument, that all animated beings are a product of water. However, that conclusion is contradicted by other sensory perceptions about water, which is that water lacks any shape or morphology. This makes it impossible for water to be the origin of living creatures who are all of finite shape and have a standing constitution. There's a certain sturdiness to living creatures. We are vertebrates, and even invertebrates have structure and constitution, such that you cannot say that amorphous, unformable water can be solely responsible, and nor can it be even the primary ingredient in the constitution of living creatures. When encountering two contradictory conclusions, one must choose the more compelling one. And as Rav Kitover writes in his commentary, we must therefore conclude that man's primary ingredient is earth and not water. In other words, when you break down the human being to its most, or any living creature, to its most basic ingredients, the majority of those ingredients will be earth and not water, using Empedocles' four classic elements of earth, wind, fire, and water, right? So one theory may say that the primary ingredient is water, and no, you have to conclude that the primary ingredient is earth, because otherwise man would have no substance and no shape, no form, no structure. Okay, so that's the third error. Make sure your conclusions do not contradict other previously established conclusions. Let's look at the fourth error that people could make. A person may come to an inductive conclusion based on his sense perception, but one part of that conclusion contradicts another part of that very conclusion. For example, a person may conclude that anything that gives me pleasure is good, and the opposite, things that bring me displeasure, are evil. Which, of course, if you're going to assume that, then when ice cream gives me great pleasure, so ice cream is good, and Brussels sprouts, for those who don't like eating their vegetables, that's bad. Now, of course, that would be the way a child thinks, right? Child thinks ice cream good, Brussels sprouts bad. But he says that might be a conclusion that a more primitive thinker might have, but that would be an error because you're going to find an inherent contradiction. If defeating my enemy is good, but it's only good for me, my enemy's defeat of me is good for him, but bad for me. So let's say it pleases person A to see his enemy B eliminated. However, one's enemy has the opposite objective. What gives person B pleasure would be to see his enemy, person A, eliminated. They can't both be true. You cannot say that A's objectives are good if B's objectives, which are contradictory to that, are also good. So therefore, how do you reconcile that? So you can't, and therefore your induction that that which gives me pleasure is good is not always going to be true by virtue of the fact that what's good for me may be bad for someone else or the victim of my goodness. Okay, thus one act would be both good and evil, which is of course a contradiction. Another type of contradictory situation, which is a little bit more complex, a person may arrive at a conclusion for such and such a reason, but upon careful examination of his reason, this very same reason obligates a different conclusion that is not part of that person's belief. One would then be obligated to reject the stated reason. So, for example, Aristotle had promoted a belief in the eternality of the universe. The universe as it exists today has always existed. One of the reasons for those philosophers who subscribe to that is because they only accept as real that which their senses perceive. And since people only perceive that which exists currently, that which exists currently must be the way things have always been, because the only real things are the things that I can perceive with my senses. And so if I can only perceive things as they are now, that human beings have a certain shape, and birds have a certain shape, and insects have a certain shape and behavior, then the world as it exists today must always have been that way as well. There was no process of evolution, there was no creation, and so forth. But this very same reason, that they only accept as real that which their senses perceive, would also force them to conclude that current reality has not always existed, since no one perceiving reality currently was around to perceive reality as it was in a bygone era. No one who is alive today in the 21st century knows exactly, was able to perceive things as they were 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. So if you weren't there to perceive it, how do you know that it existed? So your belief in the unchanging eternality of the universe is all based on the argument that whatever I perceive is real. Well, then anything that you don't perceive is not real. How then can you extrapolate as to what existed 1,000 years ago when you did not perceive it? So the logic is basically self-contradictory. If the only things that you perceive, if the only things that are real are things that you perceive, then anything that existed before your perception kicked in cannot be real. And therefore, that's a blatant self-contradiction. So therefore, you have to make sure that your logic is not self-contradictory. And finally, the fifth error. A person might reject thesis A because of reason B. But because of his rejection of A, he comes to a conclusion, let's say C, that is even more riddled with difficulties than A. So in other words, a person says, I think A is true based on B, but he then, he rejects A as being true because of this argument B. But once he's rejected A, he chooses a different belief, and that belief is even more problematic than the original belief was. So for example, some monotheists are absolutists in their belief in God's omnipotence. God is capable of doing anything and everything. So, as such, they concluded that it is not impossible for God to bring back time, to say that yesterday is still a possible reality to God to revisit. God is able to turn back time. If God can do anything, God can turn back time, right? It's almost like the philosophical question, is God capable of creating a rock that is too heavy for him to lift? If God is timeless and not bounded by time, then why can't God bring yesterday back and bring it into our existence once again? This, however, is a greater evil and more absurd than denying that God can bring back time. And it is something that I will discuss at the end of the second essay when we get into some of the arguments about what God's capacities are and what he does for this universe Reb Sadia will also explain why that's a fallacy to think that God can bring back time. In summary, if a person wishes to arrive at truth regarding knowledge gained through induction, he must guard himself from 5 potential errors. And this is just to review what we've just seen. He must ensure that there is no other logical explanation for the observed phenomenon. He must ensure that there is no other logical explanation for the intuited rational truth. He must ensure that his conclusion does not contradict any other inducted fact. His conclusion must not be self-contradictory, where one part of the conclusion contradicts another. And finally, his conclusion must not be worse than the one he had previously rejected. We add, he says, an additional 2 precautions against error. Number one must exercise expert care in ensuring that his senses and his rationale are perceiving things correctly, as I have discussed above. The previous section of the introduction was where Reb Sadia said that a person has to be well trained in making sure that what I perceive as real is real, and that I'm not perceiving a mirage, for example. And that I also have to make sure that my rational intuitive faculty is sound, and that I'm not having a dream that is completely fantasy, okay? And number 2, one must be methodical and patient in this knowledge acquiring endeavor, seeing it through to its end to ensure that it is free from errors. Don't impulsively jump to conclusions. Be methodical. Make sure that you start at the beginning and end at the end. Thus, if someone wishes to make a knowledge claim, we would test him with these 7 criteria. The first 5 that we've mentioned, and these last 2, number 1, making sure your senses and rationale are well tuned and well honed, and number 2, making sure you're methodical and patient in thinking things through. Only after being rigorously tested and weighed would we accept another person's conclusions as truth and comport ourselves according to his conclusions. Same type, and this is where he ends this section, the same type of truth-gaining process must be applied to the extraction of truths from our tradition, that is, the words of the prophets. As we will see, remember, Reb Sadia had told us that in addition to those first 3 methods of how man acquires knowledge, there's a 4th method, which is from our tradition, learning the psukim of Tanakh and our oral tradition to give us truths about reality. But how do we extract those truths from the verses of Tanakh? We also have to apply very careful jurisprudence and methodology in order to make sure that we are interpreting the psukim correctly. This is not the place, however, to explain this process of extracting such truths. I have done so in great length in my introduction to my Torah commentary. Now, this lengthy introduction to Reb Sadia's Torah commentary, according to Reb Kafich, is sadly, tragically lost to us. We do have, based on manuscripts, Reb Sadia's commentary to the Torah, which is printed. Reb Kafich did a beautiful translation of it, and we have it extant, but we don't have this lengthy introduction where Reb Sadia lays out a philosopher's methodology of extracting truths from the psukim, and that's unfortunate. Anyway, this concludes section 5 of the introduction. We're going to take a break here for Pesach, and for at least the next 2 Mondays, we will be on break. I'm actually considering the possibility of doing a class the day after the 8th day of Pesach. I know that many of our listeners are in Israel, and so you're saying to yourself, well, it's 2 days after Pesach. Why not have a shiur? I'm not sure where my state of mind will be after 8 days of matzah in the diaspora. So I'll keep you posted. Please check the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevuchim, and if those on Web Yeshiva, check that site to see if we're going to be on for 2 weeks from today. But we'll definitely be off on Monday of next week. I wish you Chag Kasher v'Sameach, everybody. Anyone have questions or comments at this point before we break for today?
Thank you very much. Have a Chag Kasher v'Sameach.
Chag Kasher v'Sameach. The same to you all. And, thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.